The series images of the universe has highlighted the influence of the isolated observer on the direction of some forces which act within space-time. Most prevailing opinions tell us that the universe would have only one side, the inside. It is that each of us would be an integral part of this internal expansion movement, which would have been established after the Big Bang. Nothing would exist outside of here. As a result, anti-gravity, which should drive expansion, would not exist in practice, or would be a fictitious force. It would have its place taken by a mysterious energy, also called dark. For science, as a rule, everything that exists is what can be directly measured. This is still a matter of points of view, because it is our memory that gives meaning to external events, although they do not depend on it. Probably, our memory is that it would be establishing the concept of sides to the universe. What can be remembered, in this case, would depend on time in the past, and would remain on the inside of our observable dimension. Logic assumes that the universe should not have sides, because the existence of an inside would necessarily be linked to the existence of an outside. That's what happens with any box. I believe that the universe is an inexhaustible source of energy and information available outside space-time, and that, in some way, we could drink from this source, as we are an integral part of it. For some unaccountable reason, we would be separated from the primary universe by the dimension of time. This would prevent us from interacting with matter in real time, in the here and now, which is ensured by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. In order to be seen, a particle must first be illuminated, a process that disturbs its position or its speed. On the other hand, time would determine our individuality, placing us in a form of illusory isolation, even in the midst of the crowds. This individuality is also manifested in the elaboration of texts contained in the sacred books. Many of them demonstrate that their writers had real insights, or intuitions, that they themselves would not be able to explain the origin. The human view of the facts also demonstrates that the authors of these texts were unable to avoid the contamination of the messages from their own point of view. In order to make sense, we need to confront any report that comes to us with the standards and stereotypes that we have stored in our memory. The feeling of guilt, for example, is inherent in human nature and is evident in many biblical texts, as is the case in the book of Genesis. The description of the image of Adam and Eve's expulsion from paradise would be a good example of contaminating an inside. The forced exile of Adam and Eve is considered as a form of divine punishment through disobedience. As everything depends on humanized points of view, mine is that the scene set in paradise should be restricted to the meaning of the process of awareness on the part of the human being. It would have nothing to do with guilt and punishment. Even to try to understand the scene of paradise, you would have to get rid of the guilt, as you would commit the apparent sacrilege of trying to penetrate the mind of God, an attitude that most physicists would consider to be perfectly natural. Thankfully, we are not in the time of the Inquisition. Anyway, God would have created a paradise of delights that, until the scene of the temptation of Adam and Eve by the serpent, was useless. To solve the problem, God would have decided to present a human being with a conscience. With that, there would be, in the immensity of paradise, someone who could finally admire his work, even that someone always did it late. The other interpretation of the biblical text, whereby the awareness would come from the couple having committed the sin of eating the fruit of the tree of life, would compromise logic. Let us suppose that you were living at the same time in any place on earth without having the slightest idea of what was going on around you and being guided only by your primary instincts. Without being aware of your own nakedness, how could you make choices between sinning and not sinning? The evidence of the awareness of the couple mentioned is evident in the following dialogue, which appears in the book of Genesis. The woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good to eat, and took the fruit and ate it. Then she gave it to her husband, who also ate. And their eyes were opened, and, having known that they were naked, they sewed fig leaves. And the Lord God called for Adam, and said to him, "Where are you?" And he replied, "I heard your voice and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid." God said to him, "But who made you know that you were naked?" The disturbance generated by the awareness of nakedness would be fully compensated with the enchantment that would have followed. By removing the veil from over their eyes, Adam and Eve were able to contemplate the magnitude and splendor of creation. Thus, expulsion from paradise would be more a divine blessing than a punishment. If paradise were the name borrowed from a static universe, where there is no time, that is, without memory, perhaps you would have to be expelled from there in order to be aware of what was happening around you. This would not imply that you had to physically leave your place in space. This new fictional place, three-dimensional due to the addition of time, would be like an antechamber of paradise, a temple bubble, then called space-time. According to the biblical text, to prevent that, even in exile, Adam could reach the fruit of the tree of life, by only extending his arm, God would have placed an angel at the entrance to paradise, carrying a shining sword. This makes clear the condition of the human being's temporal exile, and, at the same time, reveals that paradise would be within reach, here and now. The viewer must keep in mind that I am merely expressing an alternative point of view, with no commitment to the truth. From our awareness, the beginning of time counting would have always been in our position, and not in the position of the stars now distant, which are observed in space-time through their images. It is our temporal memory that gives meaning to what is outside, and that we always see late. When expelling Adam from paradise, God would have placed him on the zero mark of time, and at the center of the observable universe. It is true that God would have done the same with Eva, with the Andromeda Galaxy, with the Milky Way and everything else. Among all the centralized bodies, however, only Adam and Eve, now endowed with a memory, could have an idea of what was happening around them. The idea that everything that existed in temporal exile would have to be on the center, as is the case with planets, stars and galaxies, could explain the insight that would have given rise to the Big Bang Theory. The temporal inversion, associated with the gravitational collapse of all this maths, concentrated in a small point in space, would explain the negative nature of the potential elastic energy, which would accompany the expansionary movement. Space-time, in this case, would have to have resulted from a kind of implosion. However, being on the center is a peculiar characteristic only of those who can express their point of view. All galaxies could occupy their own center, but they would have no way of knowing that. Therefore, when occupying the center that would be destined for singularity, the observer would start to contain space-time as an intrinsic movement. as the temporal dimension would be the sole responsible for the superposition of the light waves, which will result in the formation of the cone of light from the observer's past. Time would instantly unfold the black hole, or the center occupied by the observer, allowing the virtual distance between galaxies. This type of Big Bang would have nothing to do with an explosion, since everything that the observer started to see, now instantly, was already there before. The only geometric description that allows to place all galaxies in the center of the universe is that of a space with only two dimensions. That is, with width and length. Time would not be part of this type of universe. Therefore, even if it existed physically, paradise could not be catched by our memory.